Let's get to our first guest this morning. Conservative MP, member of the Home Affairs Select Committee, Tim Loughton. Good morning to you, Tim.
Good morning, Julia.
Good morning. We've had some strong words from Boris Johnson and Priti Patel in the last 24 hours. Video from Boris Johnson, Priti Patel speaking in the Commons, basically saying, the violent protesters must face justice and there's no justification for taking law into your own hands. An awful lot of people, though, watching what happened over the weekend and thinking, the protesters were allowed to run amok. There hasn't been, yes, we've seen some arrests, 135 people arrested indeed, but 62 Metropolitan Police officers were injured, one very seriously in hospital with a punctured, collapsed lung, for goodness sake. Where does this end? And has the government actually got control and the police the control of our streets anymore?
Well, the answer to that is yes, and we must have, and it must be seen to have control. And I think there were serious questions to be answered about the policing of some of these demonstrations. The vast majority of the demonstrators were peaceful, we know that, but frankly, social distancing went completely out of the window. And however strongly we all feel about the cause that gave rise to those demonstrations, the advice is not to congregate in public. If it were done by other people, then you'll be subject to a penalty from the police. So there was no excuse for it. But absolutely there was no excuse for that small minority who were just complete and utter thugs, who've done the cause no end of damage by hurling missiles at the police, by spooking horses, and by desecrating war memorials and statues around Parliament. And I think that's the real thing that needs to be dealt with before this thing does get out of control and people think they've got free licence to go around toppling any statues or hurling any missiles at any police that they choose.
Well, I think the vast majority of right-thinking people, I think the vast majority of this country are right-thinking, would be opposed to, a violent protest on our street and damage to a property and indeed, throwing things at the police. However, there has been some support for the removal of the statue of Edward Colston, the slave trader in Bristol, but not by the method that it was done. This is something that should be done, by petition and by a local election or whatever. Well, again, this had been happening for quite some time in Bristol, but the people I spoke to yesterday were saying, it wasn't happening soon. Quick enough for us. We've been trying to do this for a long time. It hasn't happened, and therefore they took matters into their own hands. The London Mayor Sadiq Khan has just formed the Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm to review statues and landmarks across the capital. No doubt this will happen in other major cities as well, to ensure they reflect the capital's diversity. Now, given that most statues were put up in this city and indeed in this country at a time when, white men were pretty much the only people to whom you had statues, maybe the occasional horse as well. Very few women have statues, certainly very few black or Asian people due to the history of this country. Do you think we are going to see a mass takedown of pretty much every statue and every monument to our past, and should we?
Well, I hope not, and no, we shouldn't. And where does that stop? Because you're right, Julia. I mean, certainly statues that are around in London and many other major cities reflecting, Victorian imperialists and benefactors who may have done some things we certainly wouldn't approve of these days, but whose money poured into building great cities, they don't reflect the diversity to today. And you start with statues. Do we then start banning books of people we don't like? I think in the case of Edward Colston in Bristol, clearly somebody so closely identified with the slave trade, whose money came from the slave trade, it's highly questionable as to why that statue is still up. And probably that statue belongs in a museum of the slave trade, so people can learn about the horrors of the slave trade and also how it was abolished and our part we had in all of that, but have it on public display. But the way to do that is to get local consensus, by petitions, by referendums or whatever, and get your council to decide, no, we take it down, not for the mob to go and haul it down, because, as I say, where does that stop? I mean, if we look at Parliament Square, there's statues of, for example, Gandhi. Now, Gandhi, for all the great stuff he did, he had some pretty distasteful views about Africans that you could construe as racist. So should we be taking down Gandhi's statue?
He had some pretty distasteful views about young women as well.
And there's probably not a statue where there there isn't a counter view for saying, well, that actually doesn't set a very good example. Statues are there also to learn from history. Museums are there to learn from history, and that means learning from the mistakes and the horrors of the past to make sure we don't make them again in the future. Simply to topple and destroy and ban things we don't like is not the way to learn from them, and then it becomes very subjective as to what is in the acceptable box and what's in the unacceptable box as well.
But this is the issue, isn't it? Is that this is about rewriting the past. I can't see what taking a statue down is going to do to change our future or change the lives in the present of young black and Asian people who feel that they are being discriminated against. I think a lot of people listening to this right now are concerned that the police and this government, politicians generally, are running scared, that you are afraid to stand up, afraid to be counted. Everyone just gets the R word thrown at them every day. Now, you're a racist, you're a fascist, you're this. If you don't play along, it's not only now, if you don't say the right things, if you don't say anything at all, you're also in the wrong. Silence is violence were some of the signs that were held up the Black Lives Matter rally. But Black Lives Matter, they are not just about having better race relations and a better life and an end to racism, which was something I think we should all agree with. But their aims on their own website says a commitment to dismantle imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and the state structures, they mean the police, that disproportionately harm black people. They also want a redistribution of wealth via slave reparations to black people. I don't agree with any of those things, so I don't agree with Black Lives Matters. Does that make me a racist?
Of course it doesn't, and I think the really worrying thing about this the momentum behind some of this and on some of the extremes is that you have to prove that you're not racist, and we're also almost being judged on a scale of how unracist you actually are. Yeah. We all have a duty and a responsibility to make sure we have as an inclusive a society as possible, and that everybody has the opportunity, from whatever background, from whatever cultural background, from whatever geographical background, or whatever, to have the very best chance of getting on in life and doing their best. That applies to everybody, regardless of their background, as I say. That's where we have a duty. But there is a modern tendency, I'm afraid, that if you don't agree with the latest campaign, woke, trendy, or whatever you want to call it, then you must be against the principles on which it stands. And I just think that is deeply, deeply dangerous. Most people in this country, as you say, most right-minded people in this country, which is most people, abhor racism. They don't want to see racism, and they want to see it clamped down on. And we've done a lot in this country. We need to do a hell of a lot more. And I also take issue with those people who think, in some way, that the British police are to blame in the same way as the American police, almost as if George Floyd was killed over here. He wasn't. We have problems in the police. We know that. But we've come a long way, and we've got a lot more to do. But the default position is we hate racism. When we see it, we root it out, and to make sure it's clamped down as much as possible, and to make sure that everybody from every background has every opportunity to succeed. That should be what we can all sign up to, rather than, well, if you don't sign up to this and if you're not in favour of pulling down a statue, you must be a racist. Absolute nonsense, but very dangerous nonsense as well.